She said it because she was suffocating. Suffocating under the weight of her father's debts. Suffocating under the lace of a gown she couldn't afford. Suffocating from the pretense that her life was still her own to live. "Whoever walks through that door is my husband," Lady Charlotte Whitmore teased, her voice ringing out with a frantic, brittle edge that she prayed sounded like humor. Behind her, Miss Eleanor and the others dissolved into giggles. Miss Penelope tapped her fan against her chin, playfully scanning the horizon for a victim. They thought it was a game. They thought the world was kind enough to allow for such jokes. Then the heavy groan of the iron gates cut through the laughter. The sound was sudden and absolute, like a gavel hitting a bench. The amusement died instantly, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. A man stepped through the opening. He was tall, draped in a dark tailcoat that seemed to absorb the afternoon sun rather than reflect it. He didn't look confused. He didn't look like a guest who had lost his way. He looked like a man arriving to collect a debt. He looked directly at Charlotte. The air left her lungs. Mr. Theodore Blackwood had arrived. The Whitmore garden was a sea of pastel silks and shallow promises. Peach, light blue, and lemon yellow gowns swirled across the manicured lawn as Eleanor and Margaret whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes bright with the thrill of the season. The sun was golden and forgiving, casting a warm glow over the silver tea service and the delicate porcelain cups. But Charlotte felt a winter chill. She stood at the edge of the terrace, her gloved hands clasped tightly against her chest as if she could physically hold her heart in place. The blush pink of her bodice felt like a lie, a soft color for a hard reality. He was closer now, his deliberate steps crushing the grass with a rhythmic, terrifying purpose. Everyone in the town knew the name Theodore Blackwood. He was the man with a vast, silent fortune and the reputation for being as unyielding as the iron gates he had just passed through. He was a man mothers warned their daughters about, not because he was a rake, but because he was a machine. A man who never smiled. A man who never played games. And now, he was crossing the lawn, his intense gaze never wavering from hers, coming to claim a promise she had never intended to keep. The laughter of the women behind her didn't just die, it curdled. Miss Eleanor's hand froze mid-fan, and the soft clink of Margaret's teacup against its saucer sounded like a gunshot in the sudden vacuum of the garden. Charlotte felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a trapped bird fluttering against the cage of her bodice. Theodore Blackwood did not stop until he was a mere yard away. Up close, he was even more imposing, a tower of dark wool and starchy white linen that seemed to block out the very sun. His eyes were not the warm brown of the earth, but the hard, polished flint of a mountainside. "Lady Charlotte," he said. His voice was a low, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate in the space between her lungs. He didn't ask it as a question. He stated her identity as if marking a ledger. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed to whisper. Her gloved fingers tightened against her chest, the lace of her sleeves pressing into her skin. You are early for the promenade." "I am exactly on time to answer a summons," he replied. His expression remained a mask of marble, devoid of the teasing smirk or the polite confusion that usually followed a social blunder. Beside her, Penelope let out a small, nervous titter. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood, you must forgive her. Charlotte was only being—" "I was joking," Charlotte interrupted, her voice gaining a frantic, higher pitch. She tried to force a smile, though her lips felt brittle. "A silly game, sir. A wager between friends to pass a dull afternoon. Surely a man of your stature understands the nature of a jest." Theodore tilted his head slightly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her trembling hands before returning to her wide eyes. The intensity of his focus made the rest of the garden, the pastel dresses, the flowering hedges, the gossiping peers, blur into insignificance. "I am a man of many things, Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "but I have never been accused of having a sense of humor, especially not where my name is concerned." He took a step closer, effectively cutting her off from the group. The air around him smelled of rain and expensive tobacco, a sharp contrast to the flowery perfumes of the tea party. "You made a public declaration," he continued, his tone as steady as a funeral bell. "In front of witnesses standing. You claimed that the man who entered those gates would be your husband. I have entered. I have accepted. But it's impossible." Charlotte gasped, a flush of heat rising to her cheeks. One cannot simply decide a life's path on a whim in a garden. Many have decided for less, Theodore countered coldly. Your family needs a solution, and I require a wife who understands the weight of a promise. Do not insult us both by pretending you did not mean to be heard. He offered his arm, his dark-clad form a stark shadow against her blush-pink silk. Walk with me, Lady Charlotte. We have a contract to discuss. The gravel crunched beneath Theodore's polished boots with a sound like bone snapping, a harsh rhythm that drowned out the frantic whispers of Eleanor and Penelope behind them. Charlotte's hand hovered over his sleeve, her lace-clad fingers trembling so violently she feared she might tear the fine wool of his coat. Walk, he commanded softly. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor. She placed her hand on his arm. The heat of him radiated through her gloves, a startling, living contrast to the wintry stillness of his expression. As they moved away from the terrace and toward the secluded yew hedges, the world of pastel silks and porcelain tea sets seemed to vanish, replaced by the suffocating reality of the man beside her. "Mr. Blackwood, please," Charlotte whispered once they were out of earshot of the others. She stopped abruptly, forcing him to turn. "My family. We are in a precarious state, yes. But this is madness. You are a man of logic. You cannot possibly want a wife to win on a dare." Theodore looked down at her, his dark brows drawing together in a way that made his face seem carved from granite. "Logic is exactly why I am here, Lady Charlotte. Your father's debts are no longer a secret in the city, though the town is polite enough to pretend otherwise until the bailiffs arrive." The blood drained from Charlotte's face. She felt the sting of the truth more sharply than any insult. "I require a wife of impeccable lineage to solidify my standing," he continued, his voice as dry and precise as a legal brief. "You require a fortress to protect you from the creditors and the scavengers circling your home. I do not care for the whim that brought me through those gates. I care for the result." "And what is the result?" she asked, her voice shaking. "A life of silence. A husband who views me as a line in a ledger." "A life of security," he corrected. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her pink gown, turning the soft blush to a bruised mauve. "I offer you a contract. I will clear every penny of the Whitmore debt. I will provide you with an independent allowance that your father cannot touch. In return, you will manage my household with the grace you were bred for. You will provide the appearance of a stable, aristocratic union." Charlotte stared at him, her breath hitching. "And affection. Or a family." Theodore's jaw tightened, a brief flicker of something dark and ancient passing through his flinty eyes. "I do not deal in affection, Charlotte. It is a volatile currency. As for an heir, that is a requirement of the future, not the present. For now, I offer you a cage, perhaps. But it is a cage made of gold, and the door stays locked against the world, not you." He held out his hand again. "The choice is simple. Marry the man who walked through the door, or wait for the man who comes to repossess your bed." Charlotte looked back at the house, then at the hard, honest hand of the man before her. She reached out and took it. The carriage ride back to the Whitmore estate was a blur of retreating greenery and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Charlotte's own heart. By the time she stepped into the foyer, the air in the house had already curdled. News in the Tun travelled faster than a thoroughbred, and the scandal of the garden party had arrived well before she did. Her father was waiting in the library, his face a mottled grey. "Charlotte," he roared, the scent of stale brandy clinging to him like a second skin. "What have you done? The rumors. They say you threw yourself at Blackwood. A man like that. A man who would take a joke for a blood oath." "He didn't take it for a joke, father," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt. She stood in the center of the Persian rug, her blush-pink skirts looking garish against the dark oak of the room. "He took it for an opportunity. One you should be grateful for." "Grateful!" her mother cried, fluttering into the room with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes. "To be tied to the Iron Master? They say he has no blood in his veins, only ink and cold coins. You'll be a pariah, Charlotte. Eleanor and the others. They are already whispering that you trapped him." Charlotte felt a sudden, sharp spike of resentment. These were the people who had spent her dowry before she was even out of the schoolroom, and now they wept for her reputation. "Let them whisper," she said, her chin lifting. "Mr. Blackwood has promised to clear the debts. All of them. In exchange, I am to be his wife." Her father's anger vanished instantly, replaced by a greedy, flickering hope that was far more nauseating. "All of them? Truly?" Before she could answer, the butler appeared, looking as though he had seen a ghost. "Mr. Theodore Blackwood, to see Lord Whitmore." Theodore didn't wait to be announced. He moved past the servant, his dark presence immediately making the grand library feel small and cluttered. He didn't look at Charlotte's parents. His eyes went straight to her, verifying she was still standing her ground. "Lord Whitmore," Theodore said, his voice dropping into the room like a stone. "I believe your daughter has informed you of our arrangement. I have brought the preliminary documents." He laid a heavy folder on the desk. The sheer weight of it seemed to silence the room. Charlotte watched as her father reached for the papers, his hands shaking with a mix of fear and salvation. "The wedding will be in 3 days," Theodore continued, his gaze shifting to Charlotte. "A private chapel. No spectacle. I have no desire to give the gossips more fuel than they already have." 3 days, her mother gasped. "But the preparations, the guests." "There will be no guests," Theodore intercepted. "Only witnesses. Lady Charlotte is leaving this house, and with her, your obligations." He turned back to Charlotte, his expression unreadable as ever. For a moment, the library felt like the garden again, the two of them isolated in a world that didn't understand the bargain they had struck. "Prepare yourself, Charlotte," he said softly. "The world is about to become very loud. Ensure you are ready for the silence that follows." The morning of the wedding was stripped of the usual pageantry. There were no flowers to perfume the air, no dawn chorus of bridesmaids, only the gray, persistent light of a drizzling sky. Charlotte stood before the looking-glass, watching as her maid cinched the stays of a gown that felt like armor. It was white, but a stark, clinical white that offered no warmth to her pale complexion. "You look like a marble statue, my lady," the maid whispered, her voice tinged with pity. "Statues don't feel the cold," Charlotte replied, though her hands were like ice. The ceremony took place in a small, ancient chapel on the outskirts of the city. The stones were damp, smelling of earth and centuries of forgotten prayers. Her father walked her down the short aisle, his grip on her arm uncharacteristically firm, less out of affection and more as if he were ensuring the prize didn't bolt before the ink was dry. Theodore was already at the altar. He stood with his back to the door, a silhouette of shadow against the flickering altar candles. When he turned, Charlotte's breath hitched. He didn't look like a groom, he looked like a sentinel. His dark eyes scanned her face, noting the tremor in her lips, yet he made no move to comfort her. The vicar's voice was thin and reedy, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The words of the service felt heavy, stripped of their romantic veneer and laid bare as the legal bindings they truly were. When the time came for the vows, Theodore spoke with a clarity that made the very air vibrate. "I, Theodore Blackwood, take thee, Charlotte Whitmore, to be my wedded wife." He didn't look at the vicar, he looked only at her. "To provide for thee, to protect thee, to hold thy honor as mine own." He omitted the word love. Charlotte noticed it, and so did her mother, who let out a stifled sob in the front pew. When it was her turn, Charlotte's voice flickered like a dying candle before catching. "I, Charlotte, take thee, Theodore, to honor this bond, to be faithful, to stand where I am placed." As he slid the ring onto her finger, the gold felt unnaturally heavy. It was a thick, unadorned band, solid and unbreakable. For a second, his thumb brushed the back of her hand, and the heat of his skin sent a jolt through her that felt like a spark in a dark room. "It is done," the vicar announced, his voice sounding small. Theodore didn't kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "The debt is paid, Charlotte. You are a Blackwood now. Leave the ghosts of this house behind." They walked out of the chapel not as lovers, but as allies who had survived a siege. A black carriage waited, its door open like a waiting maw. As Charlotte stepped inside, leaving her weeping mother and relieved father on the stone steps, she realized the shadow of the altar wasn't a threat, it was a shield. The carriage door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo across the rainy churchyard. Inside, The world was reduced to the scent of polished leather and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man sitting across from her. Charlotte watched through the rain-streaked window as the small chapel and her parents faded into the grey mist. She waited for the wave of grief to hit her, the realization that she had just sold her life to a stranger. But instead of sorrow, a strange, hollow quiet settled in her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about the bailiff's knock or her father's desperate schemes. "You are remarkably silent," Theodore observed. He hadn't moved since they entered the carriage. He sat perfectly still, a book unopened in his lap, his gaze fixed on her with that same unsettling focus. "I was told I should prepare for the silence," Charlotte replied, echoing his words from the library. She adjusted her silk skirts, the stark white fabric looking out of place in the dark interior. "I find I do not mind it as much as I expected." Theodore's lips thinned into what might have been a ghost of a smile, though it vanished before it truly formed. The silence of the city is different from the silence of Blackwood Manor. One is the absence of noise. The other is the presence of history. "Is that a warning, Mr. Blackwood?" "Theodore," he corrected firmly. "If we are to be partners in this contract, you must address me as such. And no, it is an observation. My home is not a place of light and laughter. It is a place of business and order. I expect you will find it stark." "I have lived in a house full of noise and debt for 20 years, Charlotte said, meeting his flinty gaze. "Starkness sounds like a luxury." The journey took hours as the city's cobblestones gave way to the soft, damp earth of the countryside. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged line of the horizon, the carriage turned onto a long, winding drive flanked by ancient oaks. Their gnarled branches reached out like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. Then, the manor appeared. It was a colossal structure of grey stone and sharp angles, silhouetted against the twilight. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, standing defiant against the encroaching woods. There were no lights in the windows save for a few on the ground floor, making the house look like a sleeping giant. As the carriage pulled to a halt, Theodore stepped out first and offered his hand. Charlotte hesitated for a heartbeat before taking it. His grip was firm and dry, grounding her as she stepped onto the gravel. "Welcome to your new life, Charlotte," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "The past ends at the gate. Everything from this moment forward belongs to us." The doors of Blackwood Manor were as heavy as the gates of a cathedral, swinging open to reveal a foyer of black marble and soaring, shadowed arches. The air inside didn't smell of the floral potpourri Charlotte was used to. It smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the cold metallic tang of the evening air. "This is Mrs. Miller," Theodore said, gesturing toward a woman standing as straight as a spear in a charcoal-gray dress. "She has kept this house in my absence. She will answer you now." The housekeeper curtsied, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Welcome, madam. We have prepared the primary suite in the west wing." Theodore nodded curtly, but he did not follow them. He stood in the center of the hall, his dark coat making him look like a shadow cast against the marble. "I have matters to attend to in the study. Mrs. Miller will show you your rooms. We shall dine at 8. Charlotte watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing with a lonely, rhythmic precision. Following the housekeeper up the grand staircase, Charlotte felt the sheer scale of the house pressing in on her. Every hallway was lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women who shared Theodore's flinty gaze. There were no landscapes, no splashes of color, only the weight of the Blackwood legacy. When Mrs. Miller opened the doors to the west suite, Charlotte gasped. The rooms were immense, furnished in deep mahoganies and midnight blues. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it seemed to struggle against the vastness of the space. "The master prefers order, madam," Mrs. Miller said, her voice softening just a fraction as she saw Charlotte's wide eyes. "He is not a man of many words, but he is a man of his word. You will find everything is exactly as he promised." Left alone, Charlotte walked to the window. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of the iron gates she had entered. She was no longer the girl in the blush-pink dress, terrified of a creditor's shadow. She was the mistress of a fortress. As she dressed for dinner, she chose a gown of deep emerald silk, a color that felt like a shield. When she descended the stairs, she found Theodore already at the table. He stood as she entered, his eyes tracing the change in her. For the first time, his gaze didn't feel like an interrogation, it felt like recognition. "The house is quiet," she said, taking her seat. "It has been waiting," he replied, his voice low. He watched her across the candlelight, the flickering flames softening the hard planes of his face. "I told you I do not deal in affection, Charlotte. But I find that having you here, the silence feels less like a void." Charlotte picked up her fork, her hand steady. "Then perhaps, Theodore, we shall find a way to make the silence speak." The first week at Blackwood Manor was a lesson in the architecture of Theodore's soul. Everything moved with the precision of a clockwork engine. Breakfast was served at 7, the post arrived at 9, the house fell into a meditative hush by 10 as Theodore vanished into his sprawling library. Charlotte soon realized that the freedom he had promised was literal. Unlike her father, who had dictated her every breath to ensure she remained marketable, Theodore seemed entirely uninterested in her movements, provided they did not disrupt the house's equilibrium. "You are wandering again," Theodore observed one afternoon. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the gallery, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were surprisingly corded with muscle. He looked less like a gentleman and more like the Iron Master the gossips feared. Charlotte stopped, her fingers trailing over the cold marble of a pedestal. "I am learning the boundaries of my cage, as you called it. There are no locked doors for you, Charlotte. I told you that." He turned to face her, his flinty eyes tracking the way the emerald silk of her dress caught the dim light. "If you find the decor oppressive, change it. If the gardens are too wild, tame them. My only rule is honesty. If you require something, ask. Do not maneuver. Do not tease." The reminder of her joke in the garden made her cheeks flush. "I am not a child to be scolded, Theodore." "And I am not a suitor to be played with," he countered, though his voice lacked its usual icy edge. "I have spent my life surrounded by people who use words to hide their intent. I bought your father's debts because I wanted a partner who was too exhausted to lie." Charlotte stepped closer, braving the space between them. The scent of rain and old books clung to him, a grounding, earthy aroma. "And what of your intent? You say you want a wife for standing, but you hide me away in a fortress. You say you want an heir, but you do not seek my bed." Theodore's jaw tightened. For a moment, the mask of the master slipped, revealing a flicker of something raw and unsettled. "I am a man of contracts, Charlotte. A contract requires both parties to be ready. I will not take what is not offered with a clear mind." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, clenching it into a fist at his side. "The rule of this house is simple," he whispered. "You may have anything you desire, provided you have the courage to name it." Charlotte looked at the vast, silent gallery, then back at the man who seemed as lonely as the stone walls around them. She realized then that the unspoken rules weren't about what she couldn't do, they were about the terrifying possibility of what she could. The rain that had plagued the week finally turned into a tempest, lashing against the high stone walls of Blackwood Manor until the glass in the library rattled. Charlotte found herself drawn to the one room she had avoided, Theodore's sanctuary. The door was ajar. Inside, the only light came from a dying fire and a single lamp on a desk cluttered with ledgers. Theodore was not working. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, staring at a small, framed miniature portrait. He looked smaller in the shadows, the Iron Master stripped of his armor. "Theodore," she whispered. He didn't startle. He simply closed his hand over the portrait and looked up, his eyes reflecting the amber glow of the embers. "The storm is loud tonight. I apologize if it kept you from sleeping." "It wasn't the storm," Charlotte said, stepping into the room. The emerald silk of her dress hissed against the floorboards. She sat in the chair opposite him, the heat of the fire finally reaching her chilled skin. It was the silence. It felt heavy. Theodore exhaled, a long, weary sound. Silence has a way of amplifying the things we try to bury. He opened his hand, revealing the portrait. It was a woman with the same flinty eyes, but her mouth was curved in a soft, tragic smile. "My mother. She died in a house much like your father's, full of noise, debt, and men who promised love while they stole her dowry." Charlotte felt a sharp pang of empathy. "So you became the man who buys the debts instead of the man who makes them." I became a man who trusts only what can be measured, he admitted, his voice rough. When you made that joke in the garden, I didn't see a girl playing a game. I saw a woman trying to sell herself before someone else could do it for her. I stepped through that door because I wanted to be the one to buy you, to keep you safe from the others. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the ice in his gaze had melted into something vulnerable, almost pleading. I told you I do not deal in affection. It was a lie. I am simply unpracticed. I do not know how to offer what was never given to me. Charlotte reached across the space between them. She didn't hesitate this time. She laid her hand over his, feeling the calluses on his palm and the sudden, sharp intake of his breath. Theodore, she said softly, a contract can be amended. We don't have to be two strangers living in a fortress. We can be two people learning to speak a new language. His fingers curled around hers, gripping her with a strength that was no longer about control, but about a desperate, grounding need. The crack in the ice was no longer a hairline fracture, it was a flood. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside the manor windows washed in a brilliant, piercing clarity. The air was no longer heavy with the scent of damp earth, it smelled of renewal. Charlotte stood in the center of the grand gallery, the morning sun streaming through the high windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in a light. She was no longer wearing the stark, clinical white of her wedding day or the defensive emerald of her first week. She wore a simple dress of sky blue, a color that felt like the morning itself. She heard the rhythmic, familiar click of boots on the marble. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn with a startled gasp or clasp her hands to her chest in fear. She simply waited, a small, steady smile forming on her lips. Theodore stopped a few paces behind her. He looked different in the daylight. The dark tailcoat remained, but the rigid set of his shoulders had softened, and the flint in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful warmth. The workers have arrived to begin on the east gardens, he said, his voice no longer a command, but an invitation. They are waiting for your instructions. Charlotte turned to face him. I thought I might plant roses. Not the pale, delicate ones from the city, but something wilder. Something that can survive the winter. Theodore stepped toward her, crossing the threshold of the distance they had kept for so long. He reached out, his fingers grazing her jawline before tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer the heat of a stranger, it was the steady hearth-fire of a husband. I think this house has seen enough of things that merely survive, he murmured. It is time for something to bloom. Charlotte looked at the man who had walked through the door to save her, realizing that in his attempt to buy her freedom, he had accidentally found his own. The contract was no longer a ledger of debts and obligations. It was a living, breathing thing, written in the quiet moments they shared between the shadows. Are you ready? He asked, offering his arm. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and took it, her grip firm and sure. I have been ready since the moment the gates opened, Theodore. As they walked out of the gallery and toward the sun-drenched gardens, Charlotte knew the silence of Blackwood Manor would never be empty again. They had crossed the new threshold together, not as a master and a possession, but as two souls who had turned a desperate joke into a beautiful, enduring truth. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Lady Charlotte and Mr. Blackwood.